The Shroud of Turin, a 14-foot-long burial cloth from the ancient times, has come to the forefront of news once again.
The rounds on social media this week about an apparent new discovery regarding the Shroud of Turin. Reports say there is new evidence the shroud is 2,000 years old, which coincides with our Lord's life and crucifixion. These reports originally surfaced in 2022, but what appears to be new are studies concluded earlier this summer. They were focused on bloodstains and scourge marks.
This is the original photo of the shroud. The image on the shroud is visible only very faintly. However, in the photographic negative of the original photo, the image of man is rather visible. For some, this is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus. The person on the shroud is none other than Jesus himself. For others, it's an ancient religious artifact about the passion of Christ. The origin of the shroud is shrouded in mystery. Perhaps it is because of this seemingly impenetrable aura of mystery that the shroud continues to occupy the imagination of both the believers and the non-believers alike for centuries since it came to the public eyes. The question that everyone asks, could the Shroud of Turin be the real burial cloth that was wrapped around Jesus' lifeless body by the followers of Jesus Christ himself? In this video, let's go over some intriguing facts about the Shroud of Turin. What does the Bible say about the shroud in the first place? Then we shall go on to briefly look at the carbon dating that was done on the shroud in the late 1980s. Finally, we will look at the more recent scientific studies that confidently take the date of shroud to the time of Jesus Christ, the first century. Welcome to Discern Scripture YouTube channel. We post videos regularly on various topics that are related to the biblical world, its history, and its present relevance. We would really appreciate if you subscribe and help us reach a wider audience. Now, let's get on with the video. Jesus' burial shroud. What does the Bible tell us? According to the biblical accounts and the early Christian tradition, after Jesus died on the cross, he was given a proper Jewish burial. One of the influential members of the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin, he went to the Roman governor at that time, Pontius Pilate, and got his permission to take down the lifeless body of Jesus from the cross. This is what the Gospels tell us about what followed next. Now there was a man named Joseph, the member of the council, a good and upright man, who had not consented to their decision and action. He came from the Judean town of Arimathea, and he himself was waiting for the kingdom of God. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body. Then he took it down, wrapped it in linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock. This passage tells us that Joseph of Arimathea took the lifeless body of Jesus and he wrapped it in linen cloth and he placed it in a rock-cut tomb. Next reference about the shroud is found in the accounts of Jesus' resurrection in John chapter 20, verses 3 to 7. So Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the stripes of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the stripes of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. The disciples saw the stripes of linen lying there. And there is also a reference to a cloth that wrapped around Jesus' head. Perhaps this is the last reference to the shroud in a while until it showed up in France in the mid-14th century. The Shroud of Turin, events around its re-emergence. For the next 1300 years, there are little or no direct reference to the shroud in early Christian writings. The shroud appeared or resurfaced in France in the 1350s. There are several unresolved questions about how it got to Europe from the Holy Land. The commonly accepted view is that the shroud was in possession of the Byzantines in the city of Constantinople. When the Crusaders unfortunately sacked the city of Constantinople, they must have taken the shroud and brought it to Europe. It is reasonable to hold the Crusaders responsible for bringing this artifact back to Europe. A French knight named Geoffroy de Charnay, one of the descendants of the Crusaders, presented the shroud to the church in Lirey as Jesus' authentic burial shroud. After the church of Lirey put the shroud on display, the church began to draw a lot of pilgrims. However, many prominent members of the church remained skeptical of its authenticity. Some claimed it was a holy relic, the real burial cloth of Jesus, but others saw it as an icon, an artistic representation of the burial of Jesus. The shroud also was sold and changed hands among some of the influential European families at that time. Also, it nearly burned down in the fire in 1532. The fire was accidental. The shroud was damaged when the molten silver from the reliquary case, which was used to hold it, dripped onto the fabric. The shroud was scorched and had some burn marks and water damage from efforts to extinguish the fire. Repairs were made, including the addition of the patch of cloth, which is still visible today. Few decades later, in 1578, the shroud was placed in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in the city of Turin, Italy. Ever since, the shroud has been kept there and being visited by millions of people every year. Catholic Christians would consider the shroud as one of the most venerated holy objects, while Orthodox and Protestant branches of Christianity wouldn't share such enthusiasm for the shroud in general. The belief that the shroud, as the original burial cloth of Jesus, was undermined by the results of carbon dating done in 1988. So let's briefly discuss the 1988 carbon dating on the Shroud of Turin. In 1988, carbon-14 dating tests were conducted on the Shroud of Turin. The carbon dating was performed by 3 independent laboratories: the University of Oxford, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. The laboratories obtained the samples taken from the small section of the shroud. These studies concluded that the relic dated to the medieval period, especially between 1260 to 1390. The findings implied that the shroud could not be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, as it appeared to be a medieval creation rather than an artifact from the time of Christ. The results were widely reported and sparked significant controversy. Many began to call the shroud a medieval artistic creation and therefore not authentic. In fact, the conclusion of 1988 radiocarbon dating is being widely accepted among the scientifically minded people. Christian apologist Dr. William Lane Craig was recently asked what he thought about the Shroud of Turin. This is what he said.
What about the Shroud of Turin?
Until the authenticity of the shroud is proved, I don't think it's wise to appeal to it. It certainly is a stunning artifact. No one knows how to explain the image of the man on the shroud. But until those carbon dating tests that showed it to be medieval are decisively reversed, I think it has a question mark behind it.
As Dr. Craig said, unless the results of the radiocarbon dating is reversed, we cannot take this cloth as the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Many might resonate with his reasoning. In the following years, after the carbon dating, the story behind the carbon dating method began to unravel. Raymond Rogers published an interesting article in 2004 titled Studies on the Radiocarbon Sample from the Shroud of Turin. He analyzed the validity of the samples, whether right samples were used for the purpose of radiocarbon dating. What he found was shocking. This is what he concluded. The combined evidence from chemical kinetics, analytical chemistry, cotton content, and pyrolysis mass spectrometry proves the material from the radiocarbon area of the shroud is significantly different from that of the main cloth. The radiocarbon sample was thus not part of the original cloth and is invalid for determining the age of the shroud. Now, what does this mean? The sample used for radiocarbon testing was taken from the patch that was stitched into the shroud after the 1532 fire incident. How do we know that? The result of a 1988 carbon dating contains some cotton element, which was not original to the material. You might remember the entire shroud is linen. Cotton was stitched into the side to mend the damage done by the fire of 1532. Since the sample was taken from the patched area, it dated the sample correctly to the medieval era. Other scientific studies have also been done around the same time: pollen analysis, blood sample analysis, numismatic analysis, and so on. All these studies contradict the conclusion of the 1988 carbon dating. The most recent study, done on 2022, used the technique known as the Wide Angle Xray Scattering. In the latest study in 2022, Researchers from Italy's Institute of Crystallography of the National Research Council applied a technique called Wide Angle Xray Scattering to analyze the shroud's aging process. Their study and its results are published in an article in the Heritage Journal. It's titled X-ray Dating of the Turin Shroud's Linen Sample. I will provide the link to this article in the description. Please check it out. This X-ray method analyzed the natural aging of flax cellulose, converting it into a timeline from the fabric's manufacture. The team examined 8 small samples from the Shroud of Turin using X-rays to reveal intricate details of the linen structure and the breakdown of its cellulose over time. Cellulose is a component of plant cell walls. It degrades at a measurable rate, providing insight into the age of the material. The findings were shocking. By assessing the cellulose degradation through wide angle X-ray scattering, the researchers estimated that the shroud was kept in a temperature 72.5 degrees Fahrenheit with 55% relative humidity for approximately 13 centuries before it arrived in Europe. This is what the researchers said. The degree of natural aging of the cellulose that constitute the linen of the investigated sample obtained by X-ray analysis showed that the Turin shroud fabric is much older than the 7 centuries proposed by the 1988 radiocarbon dating. They concluded that the shroud must be older than the medieval dates suggested by the 1988 carbon-14 test. One more piece of evidence. The X-ray scattering result from the Shroud of Turin was compared with other ancient burial cloths. It matched with the ones found in the place called Masada from AD 55 to 75 with significant correspondence. So the researchers firmly concluded that the results of the sampled original linen part of the Shroud of Turin dates to the 1st century, not to the medieval era. This is an incredible conclusion indeed. So what is the significance of the Shroud of Turin? If the conclusions of the recent study holds up to be true, when further analysis would even probe the shroud, it would support 3 significant biblical claims about Jesus: his death by crucifixion, his tomb burial, and his glorious resurrection. These 3 significant aspects of Christian belief, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, comes alive with this one stunning ancient artifact. This is what scholars like Dr. William Lane Craig would argue as well.
So how about this? Would you support the conditional, if the Shroud of Turin were authentic, then the burial account would be accurate, or something along those lines?
Oh, yes. I think that it strongly supports the burial account that we have in the Gospels.
If it were authentic, so it depends on the probability that you think that the shroud is authentic. So for people who do think that the shroud is authentic, then it would lend incredible support for a burial account. So this would be good archaeological evidence apart from any sort of like biblical or written evidence or oral evidence.
You can't get more tangible physical evidence than something like the shroud.
If it is true, it has tremendous significance. Now, Muslims believe and argue that Jesus never died on the cross. They deny the crucifixion and death of Christ. The shroud brings up extraordinary evidence to counter such arguments. The man on the shroud has pierced marking around his head. His ribs have a gap as if pierced by a Roman spear. There is only one person that fits the description in history. That is Jesus Christ. Atheist scholars like Bart Ehrman, influenced by earlier atheists like John Dominic Crossan, claim that Jesus was not buried in a tomb at all. The shroud would stand as a strong, tangible evidence against such a view. Jesus was given a proper burial, and he was laid in a newly rock-cut tomb, as mentioned in the Bible. These atheist scholars have all been wrong all along. Gary Habermas, a biblical scholar who researches on the resurrection of Jesus, has done deep dive on the shroud. He thinks that it is highly probable that the shroud is the original burial cloth of Jesus.
Shroud of Turin. Are you convinced that that's authentic?
I'm fairly convinced. I would say mid to low probability. I would put probability for the shroud at 60 to 80, 85%.
He cites the image on the linen to be original photographic image of the exact time of resurrection. I think he might be right. Considering the current evidence that we have, we can come to the reasonable conclusion. The shroud might well be the original burial cloth of Jesus. However, to gain the full confidence in its authenticity, another carbon dating test must be performed, taking proper linen sample from the original cloth. It must be done under the objective supervision of the scientific as well as the religious representatives. For now, tentatively looking at the current cumulative evidence we have at hand, I think there is a greater probability that the shroud comes to us from the first century, from the very time of Christ. Finally, how should we make sense of the Shroud of Turin as Protestant Christians? What is its significance to us? Usually, Protestants don't believe in the power of religious relics or holy icons. Since the time of Reformation, the veneration of relics and icons are considered to be idolatry. John Calvin wrote a treatise on relics and believed that the shroud was probably a forgery by the Catholic Church, like every other scores of relics related to Jesus' passion. The reformers rightly believe that these artifacts don't have any intrinsic power or intercessory value in themselves. However, they might have historical and archaeological value to corroborate and verify and validate biblical data. It can be a powerful reminder to us that our faith is rooted in history. Perhaps God has miraculously captured the very moment of resurrection on this amazing piece of linen that was placed around Jesus' body at the time of his burial. Here is my closing reflection. In 2011, Italian physicist Paolo di Lazzaro experimented with high-intensity ultraviolet lasers to recreate similar image or shroud-like colorations on the linen. He published his result in an article titled Shroud-like Coloration of Linen by Ultraviolet Radiation. So to replicate the image on the shroud, the scientists needed 14,000 lasers, all fine-tuned to go off instantaneously at the same time for about 40 nanoseconds. It's important to note that lasers were only invented in the mid-20th century, around 1950s. How could the shroud be made with such sophisticated technology in the first century? Where could they have got the power needed to produce this enormous amount of light? This is where we need to enter the realm of the miraculous and the supernatural. There is one biblical incident that can help us understand the source of this light. Shortly before his crucifixion and death, Jesus took 3 of his inner circle disciples onto a mountain. This is how the Gospel of Matthew describes the incident. We read about this in Matthew chapter 17. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. In Luke 9:29, we see some more additional details. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as the flash of lightning. This is exactly what John saw on the island of Patmos. He saw the glorified Jesus, and he says this. His face was like the sun, shining in all its brilliance. The light, as bright as the sun with all its intense brilliance, comparable to the flashes of lightning, came from within Jesus' body as he was resurrecting back to life, completing the work of redemption, conquering the power of death once and for all. It could well be that God captured the very moment of resurrection for the entire unbelieving world to see in this tiny piece of linen.
I think what we have here is not only the face of Jesus Christ, the body of Jesus Christ, but a relic of his resurrection that God has surreptitiously planted right into our scientific culture at the very moment when everybody wants to become a skeptic. It's almost like God rearing up and saying, gotcha.
Whether the shroud is original burial cloth of Jesus or not, the fact of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection remains well attested within the biblical and historical records. Our Christian faith is primarily rooted in the veracity of the scripture, not dependent on the presence or absence of ancient burial cloth. These ancient artifacts only provide further external corroboration to attest to the biblical truth that Christians have known and believed for centuries. You cannot get closer to Jesus by praying to or praying before these burial shrouds or other ancient artifacts. And this must be remembered by anyone who venerates the shroud. The living Christ is not somewhere far away. He is close to anyone who seek him with a repentant and penitent heart. while being enthroned as a reigning Lord, the Spirit of Christ also lives within us, within every true believer. This is what Apostle Paul was referring to in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. This is the kind of relationship that is far more important, and Christ invites us to be in him and he in us. May we heed the call of Christ and invite him into our hearts as the Lord of our lives, the captain of our souls. Thank you for watching this video. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe and support our channel. Click on the bell icon so that you can get notification whenever we post a new video. Also, leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section below. God bless you all. Shalom.